weasel my way into another intern from the counseling center so I can have another morning group. So the group that I meet with in here, we're going to be meeting where we'll get some tables moved out of the way or whatever. And then and then the other group that the intern is going to be helping with is going to be right next door. So and that was trying to make sure everybody got what they needed, and I kind of got into a desperate moment and talked to the clinical director over there, and she came up with somebody. Actually, my daughter had given me a heads up about her personal opinion about who's good and who isn't over there. And one of her classmates from Densen that she raves about is going to be our other group leader. Her name's Libby Hansen. So, so I'm looking forward to that. It's not going to be like for you all that were in Shame and Grace, and we had kind of abbreviated groups with that one, which I was a little unhappy with. It's not going to be that way with this set of groups. It's going to be exactly the same time as a class, so an hour and 15 minutes. That is a little bit on the short side. Typically, the way that I've done groups in the past is 2 hours, and that's with 10 to 12 people. So I've been trying. It sounds awful, huh, Alyssa? Well, with your past experience, I would expect that. Yeah, the intern actually allowed me to get the group numbers down, and that's really was important to me because when we were cruising at 2 groups at 14, and that was just bananas. So I really didn't want to do that, and that's why I kind of did the Hail Mary, and it all worked out this time. So okay, so what I want to do this morning is continue to kind of cruise through. We before, yeah, I'm sorry.
Where does our group meet this afternoon?
Patrick Henry 100. So the Wednesday afternoon groups, I think, in the same room. So I think you all that are doing that one is with Saxby, and that's going to be in the same room. That's the big mobile, isn't it? I haven't been over there for a while. I avoid it like the plague. So yeah. Oh, okay. Yeah. Okay. So I like I've said before, a lot of times you can get fairly superstitious about I'm in a class and suddenly death and destruction show up everywhere. And I want to take a little bit of time to talk about what happened over the weekend with Kobe Bryant, and why do people have such a remarkable, pretty intense response to his death. And then we'll move on into some of the other dimensions I want to take a little time to talk about and so forth. Before I do, though, I want to circle back around and hear your thoughts, your reactions. Some of you guys haven't heard the big T, little t truth thing. Some of you have heard it before and may have been equally irritated from the first time around. But what other questions, what other reactions do you have from talking through that? If any other questions that you have up until this point in time, the one thing I would remind you is as I go along, and the more I read through a lot of your guys' reactions, this class itself kind of inadvertently talks about grief and loss and death, and also just loss itself, and in the bigger kind of context, but kind of a add in that kind of seems to crop up is how do I relate to other people, not just myself, but how do I relate to other people? And that's really where that conversation around big T and little t truth goes, and that tends to reveal our tendencies to handle things. We would much rather have them in black and white, dichotomous, all or nothing terms. And so there was a number of the journals that I read over the weekend that were basically saying, just tell me the right thing to do and I'll do it and everything will work out just fine. And that would be great if you were interacting with a computer. So, I'll stop talking. What questions do you guys have? Or other reactions you have about what we covered last time? Yeah.
The first chapter of Agree to Observe.
Yeah.
Direct me.
Right.
I thought it was really like the part where C.S. Lewis says, "I'm not worried about like needing to believe in God, but I'm worried about like why you believe such terrible things about it."
Yeah.
And I wrote a lot about that, like at least in my journal, of just the idea that like God seems so absent in loss, at least to me personally, but yet I see so many people be like, God is so good, like, what if I do this? And I'm just like, how is that the way you see things? Because that is absolutely not
Right.
the way I see it.
Right. Right. And I think our first response to any of that has to be validating the other person's experience as well as my own. The fact of the matter is that I think C.S. Lewis kind of gives voice to what a lot of people feel, and that is maybe not that God's abandoned, but like he said, God's character isn't what I thought it was. On the other hand, I think there are people that feel even more closely connected to God during grief and during those dark times. The thing is we all bring our baggage with us into grief, and that includes our beliefs about God, and that having to adjust our beliefs and all that. So that's a pretty natural thing to come along for the ride. We tend not to pay attention to that. We tend to pay attention to the expectations or the assumptions we have about God's character more than our baggage that gets in the way of seeing God as he is, as he describes himself. Maybe that's the way I could put it. So, yeah, Geraldine.
When I read Grief Observed, I wasn't expecting to be that moved by it, and I ended up crying, and I haven't cried in a really, really long time, so I was like, whoa, because I've experienced loss, but it didn't really affect me that much.
Yeah.
I kind of just moved on with my life and was like, oh, that person's gone now, and I didn't process it, but hearing him process the death of his wife on the page, on each page,
Yeah.
and how much pain he was in, I just had this new level of empathy for people who have gone through loss, because you can just tell by reading that first chapter alone, how much suffering he was going through and how angry he was and confused and just asking all these really deep questions.
Right.
And it was just really
Yeah.
enlightening for me.
Yeah, great. I mean, even as C.S. Lewis could only do, right? I mean, the nature of who he was, he would start asking questions a lot of us don't even think to ask. The remarkable thing is the humanity of the man that walked into his own humanity. And then he brings along a remarkable intellect as well. So, yeah, Megan.
Something I really connected with was the devotional book. I didn't expect that to really hit me at all. But I was reading through, it was one of the chapters about the emotions that you feel through grief, and I was like, well, Jesus felt these this whole weekend. Literally this past weekend, I just felt every single one of them, and I was like, wow, that's
Yeah.
real. And I feel validated because someone else said it.
Yeah.
It just makes it feel more real. It's okay to feel those things.
Yeah, and the thing I would add to that, and I think it happens when and that's why I think a lot of us are probably feeling like it suddenly, quote unquote, suddenly I'm aware of the death and loss and all the things that are going on around me, which gives you a little bit of an idea how numbed we become to what's going on around us as far as that's concerned. So the having a language, that's what I call it a language of the heart. And we tend to be fairly mute when it comes to those things, rather than having a fairly rich language that allows us to actually describe what's going on. So what happens when we read is it's like, yep, it's that one. I have no idea where that word is in my vocabulary, but yep, it's that one. And so that's kind of, in a sense, the effort, I think, that comes along with this. So, yeah, Cody.
I think it was interesting at the end of chapter 1, he talks about like not having any photograph of his wife that's any good, and like how he can't even like picture his wife in his imagination after living like his whole life with her. It's like, what is it about loss that makes us almost like forget like their face, but like perfectly recall other people?
Yeah, well, I think a lot of times it's almost our commitment to not forget that causes us to forget. I mean, in a lot of ways, things that we really love and care for a lot, we tend to hang on to really tightly. And if we're not careful, we'll choke the life out of it without freedom. And we do that, I think, as well with the people in our lives, where I can't recall, a picture of them, or I can't recall what their voice sounds like, or things like that. Now, that's part of the deterioration of human memory that we really despise. On the other hand, the thing is I think in a lot of ways it's still there. I think pictures make it easier because visual memory is a little bit different than other memory, procedural memory, other things that are like that. So, and since that's the case, then you're kind of searching for something that usually is always refreshed. Because our visual memory is extremely short. Extremely short. Why? Because it's always refreshed from the environment we're in. And so when that refreshing piece goes away, then how do I keep the static kind of picture I have of that person? And it's a little tougher to do. It is. Conversations, words, things that they say, jokes they tell, those sorts of things. Those things are seemingly a little bit easier, but I think it points to even a bigger picture, in psychology at least, of the nature of memory and the things that we encode in any particular way that's a little harder to do in others. So, any other questions or anything? Yeah.
Related to that, I thought it was very interesting what he was saying about because he knew her so well and all of these different, I don't know if that was just we talked about, I came back for 5 seconds to refill my water.
Yeah.
Okay, not the problem. That he was less able to recall her because she wasn't static to him.
Yeah.
And like I've encountered that before, and it's always kind of worried me. Like I could recall lots of people's faces, but like if I thought of my mom or something, then for some reason I can never quite call it up because I'm so familiar with that one image. Just
Yeah, and the fascinating thing about that is it really kind of reflects how our nervous system works. I mean, not to get too far in the weeds with this, but we thrive on novelty, so change in our environment. So the more familiar somebody becomes, the less we look at it. So when you see a baby that's newly born and in their mother's arms, what do? They are staring at her face. Because it's what? Unfamiliar. It's not like, the woman has a picture on the inside of her womb about what she looks like. Really, I mean, we thrive on novelty, and that occurs in when we have a prolonged absence from somebody. We end up writing kind of stories about what they say, how they think, what they feel, etc. Why? Because we start creating a relationship in our head with the person that hasn't been refreshed by real-time interaction. And that's the biggest challenge. And ultimately, the nature of familiarity is such that it doesn't get refreshed, partly because we just assume, again, it gets to some of those assumptions that I'll get to refresh it again. And then I don't. And that is, part of the kind of the bigger picture, I think, of just the nature of how we function, even from a psych point of view. So, any other questions? Okay, so let me pray, and then we'll take a look at something from this weekend. Father, guide us into more so into your heart for us, that breaks that we live in a world that's so broken and fallen, and that we're separated in relationships and other things along the way. I don't think well, I think in a lot of ways that you more painfully recognize that than sometimes we do, because we're so good at denial. And I pray that you'll guide us even into our conversation today, and allow our hearts to be ready to hear what you have for us. The remarkable nature of the kinds of things we're talking about is it is really, really close to real life. And I sincerely believe, I don't know if anybody else does, but I sincerely believe you're waiting in real life for us to meet us there. In Jesus' name, amen. All right, so what I mentioned, and one of the things that inevitably happens is when somebody of high stature, celebrity, something tragic happens, usually they tend to be kind of a lightning rod even for parts of us, so that when that lightning rod goes off, it connects everywhere, and it gets grounded in a lot of places. And so what I want to do, just to get this discussion going and hear your thoughts, and I'll throw whatever sense I have to throw into it, but what I wanted to show you is two different kinds of responses to Kobe Bryant's death. The first one is the NBA, and I think I've mentioned to you guys before that it seems like in sports where they're almost freer to have these rituals and things that they do symbolically to honor somebody than we are. And check out any of the uniforms that will be worn this weekend at the Super Bowl, and you'll probably see some either initials or tags on the helmets or other things in memoriam to the former owner of the Chiefs or whoever that might be. So it seems like in certain areas we're unabashed looking back in time, because we've talked a little bit about that already, looking back in time and remembering again and doing it on a regular basis. It's moments like these that happened over the weekend. It opens this window and touches everybody, because we've experienced loss in some way. We may not have experienced death. We may not have experienced that, and be careful not to use that as an excuse, not to look at the losses that you've had, the separations that you've had that are part of this. So what I have is two different relatively short clips, one of the NBA's response and other players, and then also just the larger response to the fans, the scene that was around Staples Center after Kobe Bryant died. So here is the first one from the Washington Post.
These tears that we crying, we're gonna miss you. It is not gonna go. It's not leaving today. A week from now, a month from now, a year from now, we will forever miss you, man. You're our legend, you're our icon, you're our father, you're a husband, your son, your brother, your friend. Thank you for being my friend. I love you, brother.
Kobe was an incredible family man. He loved his wife and daughters. He was an incredible athlete and a leader in a lot of ways. He inspired a whole generation of young athletes. He was one of the first ones to leave high school and come to the NBA and do so well, dominating the game and becoming one of the best scorers that the Los Angeles Lakers has ever seen.
All the players that have come after him have learned about his work ethic and what it takes to be the best that any individual can be.
Please join us in a moment of silence for Kobe Bryant. Rest in peace, my brother.
Okay, that's the NBA, and now it's for some fans.
Everybody's kind of mourning right now. But the LA feel has a different feel to it. That's why a lot of us are down here to pay our respects to Kobe and his family.
It's just so surreal. Like I grew up watching. I grew up going in the bus to watch his games and seeing him, and it's not real. The way he thought things, the way he processed things, and there's been points in my life that have been really, really down. And just seeing his highlights, seeing what he says and his quotes, and just going out there every day and giving 110%. I mean, you couldn't get a better idol, you couldn't get a better role model.
I met Kobe Jellybean Bryant in February of 2000. I'm a Make-A-Wish kid. I had acute myeloid leukemia and stage 4 cancer. I was 12. He was really inquisitive. He wasn't about himself. And I feel like that's what people don't necessarily understand about him, per se. That he was a selfless individual. I can't even cry right now, man. I really can't, because I'm still remembering that day and how happy it made me. To give me that extra motivation to survive.
I was an athlete. People didn't think I was supposed to be an athlete, but I outworked everyone. And it got me to where I was, to being a D1 college athlete. That would have never happened if it wasn't for that mentality and going up every day, watching him play and give his all every game. I mean, I hope it brings us all together in these times, and I hope we can all just process it together and love one another and just come together as a city. He's the definition of LA. When you think about Kobe and you think about LA, it's hard to think about LA without Kobe. And I think he's the definition of LA.
It seems like that when high-profile people die, particularly suddenly, we're scrambling because, in a lot of ways, it's like somebody threw a rock through a window. And you don't expect it, and it explodes, and then we're scrambling to try to bring these pieces back together again. And they seem to, because of the nature of what they go through, what people around them go through, it seems like they are emblematic of the things that we experience. And so you have people like some of these fans that we look at it and say, well, you didn't even know him. So why are you so tearful? And unfortunately, it is a non-recognition of the loss that person it's connecting with. Because dots connect. And sometimes, and I've used this analogy before, is that sometimes we take parts, and you guys, some of you, at least most of you, have heard me talk about the stained glass. We take parts of us and bundle them together and put them aside, and then something happens and they open again. And they open again with kind of a telltale experience or an event like this, particularly when it's sudden. Suddenness to a death is very different than something that's anticipated. Some of you guys have read Kubler-Ross's stuff about the fact that anticipatory grief is something very different. It's another beast altogether. So that means we've got two processes that we end up having to go through. I think when we're talking about a sudden death like this, it's like, one, it throws us way off the rails, and then it drives us into trying to control the pain somehow. And when we get to this, we'll talk a little bit more about this when we talk about the whole idea of control. There's a good portion of all of the grief process that is about nothing more than containing and controlling the pain. That's all that it is. And there's nothing wrong with that. There is nothing wrong with that. Because it is part of a bigger process. That's the key. Is that when we're thrown off the rails, we want to get back on the rails somehow. That's a natural response of ours. It is when certain conclusions are made and things that we wrestle with around that come up. And then it starts seeping out into other relationships. And then it starts kind of bringing together some old default patterns of ours when it comes to dealing with relationships and emotions and all the other things. So, but the thing that I wanted to ask you guys and hear your thoughts on is just this: is how what's your reaction when you see a high-profile person like him? Doesn't have to be him, but who dies or suddenly dies. I mean, in the 50s, there were a couple large figures in the 50s. James Dean being one of them that was killed in an automobile accident. Or Brennan referred to Rich Mullins. That was a lightning bolt in the contemporary Christian music community when Rich Mullins died. An auto accident. Nobody anticipated. Of course not. It's an accident. So what are your thoughts about this in reaction to it? Yeah.
I think for me, there were like 6 other people who died in that helicopter
Mhm.
accident, and that's what is sad with me. It's like there is other wives and husbands and daughters,
Yeah.
and brothers and sisters that like
Mhm.
also died,
Mhm.
and like there's been just like very, very, very brief mention of that. Like, I mean, it's not like it's like when the helicopter crashed, like everyone died, but like everyone was prepared like it.
Right.
None of the other. And so I don't know. It's just hard to see like everyone's like pour out so much support to that family, but
Right.
it's like there's also a wife who died,
Mhm.
and like
Yeah.
there's like the support to that family. So it's just
Yeah.
I don't know if frustrating is the right word, but like I'm just like this is like not that it's dumb, but I'm like
Yeah. Well, it's a cruel reality. It is a cruel reality of a lot of our celebrity system that we tend to have. You're right. I mean, you had 9 different ponds that a 10-ton boulder was thrown into. And in most cases, it feels like all the water drained out of that pond. And so it wasn't just the Bryant family, obviously. And so you're right. And that kind of goes to my point earlier when we started, is that the ripple effect is profound, and it reaches out a long, long, long way. Yeah, Katie?
No, I agree with what Hannah said, but then I also kind of thought too of how for his wife Vanessa, because they're such public people, I mean, I immediately went to the fact that like she didn't even have like an hour to
Right.
be by herself with her daughters
Right.
also there before literally the world knew.
Right.
Like she literally didn't even have an hour. And so
Yeah.
I just really felt for her in that way.
Yeah.
And then I also thought like I was really sitting with what Hannah said a lot about it, because I was like, all these other people are being talked about,
Mhm.
but then it might also be a blessing for their families because they don't have to read about it.
Yeah.
every 10 seconds.
Yeah.
They're
Do it in the
specific
public.
part.
Mhm.
Yeah, I mean, like, you know, Vanessa turns on the television and like sees anything.
Yeah.
So I really felt for her though.
Yeah. Yeah, for sure. Yeah, Lucy.
I was, I read an article on it, and it said that he had a daughter that was born 6 months ago, and it made me really sad
Mm.
that little girl will never know her sister
Mhm.
or her father.
Right.
She'll never remember them
Yeah.
because they died so suddenly, and all she'll have is like these embellished things about, like, I'm sure the mother will tell her stuff, but
Mhm.
all he's gonna hear about is his basketball skills. And I think that's a great loss for that little
Oh,
girl.
no doubt.
And I didn't think about it till they were
Mhm.
mentioning it, but I realized that I saw the breaking news about a helicopter
Yeah.
crashing, and I kind of glossed over it
Mhm.
until I got the later notification
Right.
about Bryant dying.
Yeah.
And then I felt kind of ashamed
Mm.
that I hadn't
Mm.
cared as much when it was just nameless, faceless
Yeah.
people.
Yeah, that's true. The little girl is really a pretty good example. The newborn is a really good example of grieving something she never knew. And a lot of times it's really hard for us to validate that kind of grief. You know, it seems like there's a social appropriateness to grieving that which you knew. But what about grieving that which you didn't know, like a future? You know, when parents lose a child, they're not only grieving the kid, they're grieving the future that will never be. And so that I think that adds to the profundity of the moment that goes into it. Yeah, Lori.
Yeah, I mean, I never like watched a lot of basketball,
Mhm.
but like when I heard about it, it was just like, oh my gosh, like Kobe Bryant.
Mhm.
Like when I was growing up, like all my friends, he was everything to
Right.
everyone. Like everything was about Kobe Bryant,
Mhm.
people were shaving their heads just to look like that.
Mhm. Yeah.
And like, man, he was so young and it was so sudden. And
Yep.
I've never been affected by a celebrity death before, but this one just felt so
Yeah.
wrong.
Yeah.
And so weird. And I was like kind of waiting for some of my like really big Lakers fans,
Mhm.
friends to like post stuff,
Mhm.
and they didn't because I think they were just too hurt by it.
Yeah. And now that you're somewhat armed, watch the process. And you'll see a huge variety from people. I mean, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I played basketball for like a couple years.
Mhm.
My really good friend, her family's huge
Mhm.
in basketball. And I was driving and I saw it like pop up
Yeah.
on my phone. And I was like, bro, okay.
Yeah.
And I like texted her and she's like, yeah, my mom is crying. Like,
Mhm.
you know, like, and kind of talked about it for a little bit. But I think even, you know, for those of us who are not athletically inclined and did not do anything with
Right.
athletics even, like everyone knew who Kobe was.
Oh, sure.
So I think that has something to do with it.
Mhm.
And like, anytime a celebrity dies, you really don't hear about like the bad stuff they did, or like, you know,
Right.
their bad characteristics. You only hear the good stuff,
Mhm.
which I think is interesting. But I watched a video today, like from ESPN news anchor, who talked about when she met Kobe, and it was
Mhm.
like very. I almost cried,
Mm.
which was really weird,
Mhm.
but like it was really touching. So I think like it's interesting to watch
Mhm.
because it's not like necessarily like when Alan Rickman died.
Mhm.
Because for me, like I grew up on Harry Potter.
Sure.
I love Harry Potter and I love Alan Rickman.
Right.
And that was harder for me than like this would be,
Mhm. Mhm.
but not like Alan Rickman's family,
Sure.
or Kobe's family.
Right.
But it's
Yep.
just super interesting to kind of like you said, like
Mhm.
be watching that process and watching like all these fans at Staples Center.
Yeah.
To see
Yeah.
how that's gonna go.
Yeah. For sure. Yeah, Emily.
Sierra and
I see a Rose. I'll be there in a minute.
Sierra and I were working last night, and we had actually really long conversation about this. But something that really like infuriated me was TMZ, which has always been like kind of sleazy, but like they broke the news before the sheriff could talk to his wife.
Right. Yeah.
And which is like unethical and
Right.
crappy on some people.
Right.
And I hope that she sues them. But, and I hope somebody gets fired. So,
That's when anger comes up.
but like, well, and I was thinking about it when we had the advocate in class
Yeah.
yesterday, and like, she like didn't even get the dignity of like finding out in person. Like she would have found out over like Twitter.
Yeah.
Or something,
Right.
because people were talking about it, and I'm sure that somebody saw the news and was
Mhm.
like, Vanessa, like, have you heard about this? And she's like, no. I'm sorry.
Mhm.
Like, there has to be some mistake.
Yeah, right.
You know, and it really, like, it just made me so angry. And then to what you were saying,
Yeah.
I hate Facebook, everything about it. But somebody that I met in Greece this summer, another intern, she posted, and it just like genuinely enraged me so much.
Mhm.
And I almost like ripped her a new one, like a Facebook comments,
Yeah.
but I didn't. I exercised some self-control. But she posted an article from when he retired
Mhm.
that was like, you know, he's retiring, everybody loves him, but like, remember this rape case from 15 years ago?
Right.
And she's like, this is why I don't admire or like uphold any celebrities, because this just reveals their true character besides what they put out on TV, and I almost killed her.
Let me extract a log from your eye.
Yeah, she was like, I'm just better than all of you, and now I'm gonna crap on him because his body's been cold for 12 hours, and that's the right thing to do.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. Yeah. No, I hear you. I hear you. I'm like most of you. I can probably barely contain myself with some of that stuff. And it is actually, social media has profoundly impacted a lot of even the mourning that we see people doing. Because, you know, when somebody, because of Facebook and all the other things, what happens when somebody dies? I mean, we had an outdoor leadership instructor here that died. And that was another good example. They kept the site up, but it was everybody's got to figure that out. We never had any of that before, and people could kind of grieve with the people that they chose to grieve with, rather than being forced to grieve with a lot of other people's input and idiocy and everything else. Okay, Rose.
I thought it was interesting, just like about how the difference between the sports teams versus the public.
Yeah.
Because when I was playing sports in high school on my volleyball team, we had a few different instances where people lost someone very close to them on the team. And we all just like really came on that person, like just it's very symbolic. Like we would use tape and write their names on, like, you know, it's
Right.
just a lot easier to honor someone's death, and even just like how they ran the clock and honored him, and like the jerseys. I can imagine. I've seen a lot of things how they want to change like the NBA logo,
Right.
have Kobe in it, and I think that's cool. I just am like curious as to why grief is able to be so much more symbolic in like sports teams. And I wonder, in my experience, if that's because like you do have your teammates who you trust
Yeah.
like around you.
Yeah.
I just think it's really interesting and also like kind of cool
Mhm.
to see how like the community, like the basketball community in general, has supported each other
Yeah.
through this. And it's like it's a massive loss to
Yeah.
the community. So I just thought that was super interesting.
Yeah, I mean, you certainly see that. you see that around like teams, and the military in particular. You know, some of you guys have been in crisis and trauma last year. Some of you are going to be are in it right now, and I usually have a guy come that was a Delta Force guy, and they have their own traditions when a brother dies or a sister dies. They really do, and that tradition is part of the landscape of their relationship with each other. And so it's the thing that I not worry about, but the thing that I react to when I watch this is, why does it take this to get us to the point that we actually start having conversations about grief and loss? Not that I have an axe to grind. But I mean, and even bigger, which is a whole nother can of worms I better not open, but I will. Why doesn't the church lead the way on this one? I mean, after all, the center point of our faith has to do with grief and loss. Resurrection, I'm not diminishing that, but it has a lot to do with that. So, Alyssa, you had your hand up?
I did. I think grief is just better than in groups. Like,
Yeah.
it's stupid, but it's true.
Mhm.
And that's why it's easier for teens, and that's why it's easier to be in a group of people to be able to celebrate or memorialize anyone, is because when you're in a group with someone, no one is focusing on you personally to grieve. You do it as a group, you feel emotions as a group. And like, yes, we teams your safety and all of those things, but also we don't see like just one person going, it's always like a group of people. And so we see that as a better spotlight than just like one person grieving, and like being memorialized through that. Like, it's never going to be just an individual, it's always going to be a group.
Yep. Yeah. And that's kind of what this highlights.
Yeah.
Is what I said at the very beginning. We were never meant to grieve alone. Because community, everybody's going to have a different response, and that community of people actually provides permission for the people of that community to actually feel things again. Yeah, Cam.
I just thought it was super interesting. I guess not interesting, but just kind of frustrating, but interesting that like people have like the audacity to be so cruel. There was this girl, I don't remember her name, but she was like on the left side, like super liberal, and basically was just like, and I'll remember from Kobe as like a sexual assault charge, and like she was just like going on, and then she tweeted it something, and then she like deleted it because people were like, how would you say, like, it was like something that was super small that got dismissed, and like he apologized for it, and he was still with his wife. But it's just, it was interesting to me of like, there will always be people in like a time of grief who will like make it worse, or like make your emotions like just feel diminished, or like, oh, maybe I shouldn't think of Kobe as like a legend, or like, you know, X, Y, and Z. So I just like was like, that's just so annoying that people
Yeah, and the thing you'll get to watch is, and actually identify, is the big T people and the little T people. You'll be able to watch it. I mean, even those remarks are, a self-appointed counterbalance to all the other things that people are saying. Why? Well, that's the subject coming up. But that's actually makes my very point about big T and little T truth, is providing people with permission to be where they are as they are, not where they should be, is what little T is about. And once we validate that, and not until we've done that sufficiently, should we ever be talking about big T. It's not all or nothing. I am not saying one's better than another. I'm not saying any of that. But I am saying that if we say we want to help people, then maybe we start with their needs instead of ours in terms of response. Yes, Sierra.
I love what she said. I totally agree, because that's, like, as much as my heart has been really warmed by, like, the response of the world, I've just been so angry about it as well, because I feel like his death has brought out a lot of cynicism in people.
Yeah.
To say things like, well, why do we only care about celebrities, or just, like, bring up his past, or I don't know, they just pick at the little things.
Sure.
I think I get frustrated when people complain about the noise that they add to the noise, like
Right.
saying, why are we talking about this? But they're talking about it, and so that's been frustrating to me. Like, I don't know, I think I started realizing it really quickly, because when I found out and I was really upset, I was with a friend who is of the mentality of, like, well, I don't get why celebrities, like, deaths are such a big deal. I was, because they're people. And I don't think it's confusing that millions of people grieve, and that it's a big thing when celebrities die, because when people are loved by millions, of course they're grieved by millions. And so it makes sense to me. And I don't know, I just think it shows that people really like to go against the grain and say, well, I just never, like, really know him, so I don't see how you could grieve him if you didn't know him. And just, like, try to take away from the grief of others, which I just think is gross.
Right.
So it's been kind of a 50-50 idea of, like, wow, this is so beautiful, seeing people's tributes and, like, recognizing his talent and remembering him and seeing all the people praying for Bryant's family and the other families.
Yeah.
But also I'm frustrated, because it's like, why do you have to be so cynical just because he's a celebrity?
Yeah. Yeah, for sure. Sam?
I'm curious to hear your opinion on the other families not being as covered.
Oh.
Like, it's not a good thing or necessarily a bad thing. But I feel like if we're talking about support of having millions and having a team that's focused around it, and how that's going to help the family get over that grief, no one's really doing that for these other families.
Right.
Like, a lot of people were impacted, like, on a one-on-one basis.
Right.
But, so I'm just curious, do you think it's good?
Well, at least as far as we know.
Yeah.
At least as far as we know. Okay, so, there was, I stay away from social media as much as I possibly can. But there was a picture that was shown of one of the guys that was on the helicopter. He was a coach, and so, the thing is again, it's kind of how we're wired. We pay attention to where the most activity is, and then we don't pay attention to what isn't in that spotlight. And I've said when years ago when I was teaching the Cog Psych class, that attention as a spotlight is not a floodlight. So wherever the spotlight is trained, that's what we pay attention to, and whatever's on the outer edges of that, it's like it isn't there. So on that point, I think there was another gal on the helicopter that was a coach in his academy. That each one of these people, I mean, if you were to create a spoke and say, all right, the big spotlight is on Bryant, but then you've got 7 other spokes that comes off of that, and all the people that are impacting and around those people. I think to some degree, they might actually feel relieved that they're not in that spotlight, because it's like, leave us alone. And the funny thing about it is, in the social media world, they get their panties in a while when people have decent boundaries and say, get out of my face and leave me alone. It's like, we're entitled to your information. No, you're not. Go away. And somehow I'm being mean or rude when I say something like that. And that's so, I mean, we know or we don't know. We see all of Bryant, and somebody like him who's that high a profile, like Sierra said, there are millions of people that were connected, and like some of the interviews, they fashioned themselves off of his work ethic, et cetera. It's all great stuff. The other people, my hunch is that they probably also are at the center of a spoke, or at the center of a wheel of the people that are coming around them now. I would certainly hope so. We don't know. We don't know. And now, I threw the church under the bus just a minute ago. I'll pull it out from under the bus for a second. The one thing that the church does offer is a social network of people that can come around people that are hurting. And when it's so obvious, usually it does a pretty decent job, usually. And so I think it's kind of a both and sort of thing. But, I don't think at this point they're probably going to be very resentful that, what about us kind of thing, rather than, we want to be with us, just leave us alone. So, yeah.
Yeah,
And then Sierra, and then we're done.
That I'm just kind of thinking about is the cross-cultural aspects
Yeah.
of this. And this is going to kind of show how people of other cultures agree. Because like we're talking a lot about Western attitudes towards
Right.
that. But like I know the attitudes, even in Jamaica, which is like the West, or Poland, they're very different. And I have a lot of friends from Africa, Jamaica, and Poland on my Facebook and on my Insta. And I've seen them posting all kinds of stuff, and it's just very interesting to kind of watch and to see, and knowing that like there's an impact cross-culturally, and just to see kind of how that plays out.
Yeah.
But then also I think you kind of brought up a good point a while back about why is it that we have to wait for some big tragedy to have a conversation about grief, or to have even like conversations about death. Like, and the thing is you give it maybe a month, if that, like that's being generous,
Right.
And it's gone. And
Yep.
like when the Oscars or whatever comes on at the end of the year, and they do the recaps of like who we lost this year, like Kobe will be in that.
Yeah.
But otherwise, like this conversation is going to end in about a week, and everyone's going to move on, and no one's really going to care.
Yeah.
But the family is still his. So I think that's kind of interesting.
Yeah, for sure. All right, Sarah, you got the last one.
I have been thinking a lot, like with this as well, about how creepy it is to realize that money doesn't save you. Like, I just don't. He was in $1 million helicopter, private pilot, all of these things, and still, like, I don't know, life is just so feeble, I guess, with having a lot of money and protection and power. None of it saves you in the end.
Right.
It's just like,
Yeah.
scary.
The one great equalizer is the punctuation at the end of our sentence. Okay. Well, thanks for participating in all of that. I wanted to make sure we had some kind of conversation about it. But what I want to go to is, and a lot of you guys know what's coming, is control or trust. And your favorite worst phrase of mine is control and trust cannot coexist. And so, whether or not you enjoy this commercial, I do, so I'm showing it anyway. So, tough. I like it. I can get to see it at least twice a semester, so shut up and watch it. So.
I've been called a control freak. I like to think of myself as more of a control enthusiast. Perfect 177 degrees. And that's why this road warrior runs from National. I can bypass the counter and get straight to my car. I don't have to talk to any humans unless I want to, and I don't. The National lets me choose any car in the aisle. Control. So, what's the word? Sexy.
I love that commercial. As the saying goes, simple things for simple minds. So, the thing about, and like I said, the thing about death is it is a punctuation point we can't get around, which means I'm bumping up against the limits of my control. And so what we see with people that have somebody die, we are rushing to try to figure out how to regain some level of control over our world, over our emotions, over everything. So now, is that wrong? No, it isn't. It is not wrong. We're designed, some people would reduce us down to control mechanisms because we're always adjusting. And you might put that in the world of control. It has usually gotten a pretty bad rap, but don't forget the fact that one of the fruit of the Spirit is self-control. Not other control, but self-control. The other thing I would make a distinction about is self-control is not self-over-control. It's not the same thing. Yes?
This might seem like a dumb question, but like I'm asking it honestly. Like,
Sure.
Because I don't know what self-control without over-control looks like.
Right.
So what does like self-control even look like? Like what is that even? I mean, I know it's like don't hit the kid sitting next to you. But like I don't know how you would have self-control without like, okay, that means I'm like controlling what happens next and everything in my life and all my relationships.
Yeah, well, it would take us. It really would take us back to what's the antidote, if you will, to control. So I think self-control is this balance between freedom and over-control. Because when I make a choice about what I want to manage in my life, we would use the word control. But I do that freely. I don't do it because I have to, so that, and then that's usually what leads us into over-control, is the if-then kind of so that kind of thinking, where if I do this, then certain things will benefit from it. At the same time, self-control is the fruit of the Spirit, which means what kinds of things do I need to cultivate in my life where that's the outcome. And I would suggest that freedom and choice is what I cultivate in my own heart about what I do. There's a lot of things we do partly to manage other people's perceptions, and a lot of things we do because we feel duty bound or obligated to do it, which steals our choice away from us. We had that little drama kind of play out in our house last night because my two grandsons, Nick, their dad was sick, and he was just deathly sick. He was throwing up a lot and so forth. And so I got home, and lo and behold, who's in my family room but these two little hellions called my grandsons, and one's more than the other. And my wife and my daughter, one of your group leader, were questioning the choices of their life, trying to help out with these guys, because Grayson has spent a whole day at his preschool, and Desi is just wound up and ready to roll, just to create all sorts of chaos around him. And so it was a tussle and a wrestling match the whole time. One of the things that they were talking about in a brief moment is reminding themselves they chose to help. That doesn't mean it's going to make it good, doesn't mean it's going to make it easy, doesn't have anything to do with that, but choice matters. And so what do I cultivate in my own heart, I think, is choice and control and freedom and motivation and understanding those things. And as one author once said, and some of you guys were in Crisis and Trauma when John mentioned it, is an author by the name of ironically, now that I'm listening to it, is cynic. It's not cynic as in a cynical person, but Cynic, I think, is his last name. But he was underlying the idea that why matters. Start with the why is, I think, the book. I haven't read it yet either. And that's part of it is cultivating a clarity about what are my motivations here, but also what are the limits to my motivations in order to empower people to do all of that stuff. So it's real complicated, but I think when we end up reminding ourselves that self-control is actually an outcome, not an objective, and it comes from cultivating certain things in our hearts, including our relationship with Jesus and including all of those sorts of things. What comes out of that is a mindfulness about the choices I make, the freedom I have. And you look in Scripture, and Jesus had that. And the reason I say that is that the things that he did was based on the choices he made. So he goes into a village in the early part of Mark, heals a bunch of people, and it's nighttime, and he goes up to the mountain to spend some time in silence and solitude with his Father. And the next morning, his disciples come up and lay out a thing about obligation to him. You healed all these people last night. They want you to come back. And what did Jesus say? He said, oh yeah, I feel guilty. I got to go back and do that some more. No. He said, no, we've got other places to go. So the cultivation, I think, of the freedom and choice and some of those sorts of things is what ends up producing this kind of fruit in conjunction with, certainly with what the Holy Spirit's doing in our lives too. So yeah, Megan.
I feel like I'm in the same boat as her because the death that I experienced, I had no control.
Mm-hmm.
So like when I sense that I don't have any control, it freaks me out.
Yeah.
I'm like, I literally can't help this. There's nothing I can do. And it's very unsettling. And then I over control. And
Right.
It just feels like a domino sometimes. I'm
Yeah.
not sure how to balance that.
Yeah, and I think your wording may have betrayed that. I can't fix this. I think the flip side of that is I can do something with me. So I can't fix that situation. You know, I lovingly remind people to resign from being director of the universe. And it would lead to a lot less anxiety. But it also, the focus has to be on the cultivation and the clarity of my own heart and what's going on in there. And that's true for grief too. It is that if I'm willing to lean into that in myself, then my capacity, it's like somebody said about, I think Geraldine said about the empathy. Empathy flows out of somewhere. And usually if we're willing to embrace and understand our own sense of pain and our own struggles and things like that, then empathy flows out of that. And I think the person you're responding to empathically knows that. If I just do it with words, it ends up being more like sympathy, not empathy. Because empathy, that EM prefix really, really matters. That SYM prefix is to feel the same as. But empathy has the same prefix in it as empowerment does. So empathy is about respecting and validating the other person's world and empowering them to see that too, rather than, feeling with them. Because a lot of times when we feel with people, we end up stealing their emotions, and then you get worried about us, and we've just kind of hijacked the whole process. So, yes, Sierra.
So usually we talk about control and trust, like with other people.
Right.
And like trust and control cannot coexist.
Right.
So when it comes to self-control, like what does that mean for like trusting ourselves? What does that look like?
Well,
Is that still an aspect of it when it's for us?
it is. I mean, the reality is we know our own brokenness and fallenness, and so that trust, if you will, with ourselves ends up being more a matter of conditional trust. I know the levels that I can get to be really stupid and be really self-absorbed. On the other hand, what is the trust about? Well, maybe it goes further to the trust in no matter what my relationship with God is, no matter what that is, the trust of the Holy Spirit's work in me that God, Jesus made the promise, or Paul said, Jesus will complete what he started in us. So that's what I land on. That's what I trust. And so that is, in a sense, it doesn't mean it's subverting my free will. But at the same time, even with my free will and bad choices, there's still redemption in those. So, yeah. Okay, so let's take a look at a few of these, and then we'll pick it up next time. When I talk about the anatomy of control, there are two different areas I want to spend a little time talking about. Again, what I did, just like what I did with the big T and little t truth, I also did when it comes to control. And this is not an exhaustive list, but it is a grief-related list, because a lot of you guys have seen this list in kind of a generic sort of way when it comes to control. But there are thoughts that support it, the way I assess things, the conclusions I make, and then there are feelings that drive it. And then the question, of course, we get to sooner or later is okay, how do I not control it, but how do I offset it somehow? So a few of these thoughts that we can look at least in this area, is just get over it. This is taking too long. Whatever too long is. And who's the judge of too long? Probably the person saying it, even if it's me. Even if it's me. That's why I put up there the control with others and with self. Because a lot of times we regulate behavior by saying these kinds of things to ourselves. It's like, this is just taking too long. And usually if I'm sitting and talking to somebody, I'm usually asking, so what exactly is too long? Let's define our terms here for a second. And usually if they really drive into it deeply enough, they'll say, wherever I am, that's too long, because it's uncomfortable. And that's okay. That I certainly get that. So handling the distortions of someone who's struggling to understand the ununderstandable. Again, someone is not only us, but also the people around us. When people say, I don't understand, it is not an invitation to explain it. It's an invitation to validate you're trying to understand something that we can't. As I've said before, it's way above my pay grade. I have no idea. I don't get why somebody who's 41, has 4 daughters, crashes into a mountainside in California. I don't know. We want it. Why do we want to explain things so badly? Because if I can explain it, I can predict it. And if I can predict it, I can control it, and I can get the outcome I desire. Welcome, Director of the Universe. Here's some more. Just tell me the steps and stages I need to get through, and then I'll be done. Check boxes, objectives, that's all part of the conversation we often have. Why do we love to ask, or how do I do this? Now, let me just say real quickly, how is not a bad question. It is not a bad question. There are times where we would much rather have steps that we could follow than life that we can engage with. And this is part of, I know we all realize this, but this is part of life. Yes, we get it. That's a big T truth. The little t truth is, yeah, but I hate it and it sucks. That's the little t truth. It's like, yeah, I'm with you on that one. I really am with you on that one. If you want to see a study in it, read Ecclesiastes. Because Solomon was reflecting on what he called the meaninglessness of things. And it really is pretty remarkable when you start thinking about it, is that the 2 books in the Bible that people usually avoid the most are the ones that have the most profound wisdom for today. Job and Ecclesiastes. And for the longest time, Ecclesiastes is still my favorite book. because it is a raw look at life as it is. And that's why Solomon would say it's a breath of wind. The interesting thing about that is that there's this whole section, after he goes through all the meaningless stuff, there's this whole section about, and there's a season for everything. And there's all that list that goes into it, okay? The last one, duty, social convention, other people's perceptions dictate how I'm supposed to grieve. I'll just let that hang out there. We'll pick it up when we start up on Thursday. And now on Thursday next week. So we'll see you.